The moment JD Vance spoke, Washington stopped pretending this was just another day. Not because of the words alone, but because of what they signaled. A break from the practiced restraint that high office usually demands, an admission, whether intentional or not, that something personal had finally crossed a line. And if you think this was only about tone, sit tight, because this moment exposed a fault line that has been widening for years. Vance did not sound like a man delivering a calculated message. He sounded like someone who had reached the end of tolerance. The anger was not abstract, not ideological, but aimed. It wasn't about policy disagreements or legislative maneuvering. It was about his family, and the quiet rule American politics claims to honor but rarely enforces. For decades, candidates have been told the same thing. If you choose public life, your family becomes collateral. You smile, absorb it, and call it leadership. The system rewards those who comply with that expectation. Vance did not comply, and that alone guaranteed backlash. Sit tight. This is where personal instinct collides with institutional expectation. To his supporters, the outburst felt overdue. A rejection of cruelty dressed up as political critique. They saw authenticity where others saw recklessness. A man refusing to let elite etiquette shield abuse. That framing resonated because it tapped into real exhaustion. Critics, however, saw something else entirely. A senior official abandoning the discipline his office requires. A dangerous precedent masked as honesty. They worried less about what was said than what it normalized. And that concern is where Adam Schiff enters the story. Schiff did not rush to defend the attacks on Vance's family. He did not minimize their ugliness. Instead, he shifted the focus deliberately. The issue, in his framing, was not provocation, but responsibility. Leadership, he argued, is defined by what one restrains, not what one feels. Schiff understands something many commentators overlook. A vice president's words do not end with him. They travel downward through the political ecosystem. They set tone, not just mood. And when escalation is modeled at the top, it multiplies below. From my perspective, this is where Schiff's argument carries real weight, not because anger is illegitimate, but because power magnifies consequence. The higher the office, the longer the echo. That reality does not disappear simply because the provocation was cruel. Vance's defenders countered with a philosophical claim. Authenticity matters more than etiquette. Citizens are tired of rehearsed outrage and sanitized responses. They want leaders who react like humans. In a vacuum, that argument sounds compelling. But politics does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in a system of incentives. And outrage is not punished in American politics. It is amplified. Schiff's warning was less moral than structural. He returned again and again to the difference between justification and permission. Yes, the anger may be understandable. No, that does not mean it should be modeled from the highest office, because others will imitate the permission without inheriting the responsibility. Authority works downward, not upward. There was humor in Schiff's response, but it was restrained. A remark about Congress needing padded walls if everyone responded emotionally. The joke landed softly, but it carried a blade. It mocked the idea that raw expression equals moral clarity, and it did so without inviting retaliation. The clash between these men was never really about profanity. It was about competing visions of leadership. Vance embodied confrontation as correction. Schiff embodied restraint as preservation. Both claimed to be protecting democratic norms. The deeper tension emerged as the debate matured. What happens when anger becomes the primary currency of credibility? When outrage is no longer a liability, but a credential? When restraint starts to look like weakness? This is not hypothetical. It is already happening. Supporters of Vance argued that silence had enabled abuse for too long, that decorum protected aggressors more than victims. In that framing, escalation becomes moral necessity, a way to redraw boundaries that had been erased. There is truth in that frustration. Schiff did not deny it, but he warned of the slope beneath it. Today, anger defends family. Tomorrow, it defends ego. The day after that, it defends power with far fewer breaks. One of the most uncomfortable questions surfaced here. When does defending one's family stop being protection and start becoming political weaponry? Who draws that line? And who benefits when the line disappears entirely? No one offered a clean answer. American politics claims families are off limits. History tells a different story. Spouses become symbols. Children become leverage. Outrage only erupts when someone refuses the arrangement. Vance shattered the illusion that the rule still holds. Schiff tried to remind the country why it once mattered. Neither could restore it alone. The system itself no longer enforces it. That reality haunted the entire exchange. As the debate continued, something else became clear. Audiences reward emotional clarity more than procedural caution. Anger travels faster than explanation. Clips outperform context, and politicians learn accordingly. Schiff's restraint risked appearing detached. Vance's anger appeared relatable. The media ecosystem reinforced that contrast, not by intention, but by algorithm. Outrage is efficient. This creates a feedback loop that is hard to escape. Politicians escalate because escalation is rewarded. Audiences reward escalation because it feels honest. Calm responses begin to feel evasive. The baseline shifts quietly. The generational divide sharpened everything. Younger audiences, raised on unfiltered feeds, distrust polish. They read restraint as calculation. Older audiences read escalation as danger. Both reactions are rational but incompatible. This incompatibility leaves leaders with shrinking options: react and be amplified, restrain and be ignored. Neither path is cost-free. Fatigue makes the louder option tempting. The final irony is that many cheering escalation also crave stability. They want someone to fight and someone to fix. But fighting and fixing require different skills and often different temperaments. Politics rarely offers both in one package. The unresolved question remains: should leaders reflect public anger or absorb it? Should power express emotion or discipline it? Should authenticity override institutional restraint? There are no easy formulas. What is clear is that moments like this do not disappear. They accumulate. They recalibrate expectations. They teach politicians what works, and they teach audiences what to demand next. If American politics has crossed a line, it did not do so quietly. It did so with cameras rolling and audiences divided. The question is not whether the line existed. It is whether anyone still feels obligated to stand behind it. That answer is being written in real time. The longer the exchange lingered in public view, the clearer it became that this was never just about language. It was about permission. Who gets to express anger, and who is expected to absorb it quietly? Who is allowed to break decorum, and who is punished for even questioning it? If you think this distinction is trivial, sit tight, because it shapes everything that follows. JD Vance framed his response as a line finally drawn, not a strategic escalation, but a refusal to play by rules that only ever seem to apply downward. To him, silence would have been interpreted as acceptance. Acceptance that attacks on family are simply the cost of public life. And he made it clear he was done paying that price. That framing resonated far beyond his base, because many Americans feel they have been told the same thing for years. Endure it. Be civil. Let institutions handle it, even when institutions never seem to show up for you. Adam Schiff responded from an entirely different register, not colder, but more cautious. He acknowledged the cruelty of personal attacks without granting them the power to dictate tone. In his view, leadership is defined by what one refuses to normalize, even under provocation, and escalation, once modeled, rarely stays contained. From a structural perspective, Schiff's concern was not hypothetical. Power does not just speak, it instructs. What a senator does in anger becomes justification for thousands who feel licensed to do the same. That chain reaction is invisible at first, then suddenly it becomes the atmosphere. Here is where the argument quietly deepened. Vance was arguing from lived experience. Schiff was arguing from institutional memory. One spoke as a man protecting his household. The other spoke as someone protecting a fragile system. Sit tight, because both are telling the truth from different altitudes. Vance's supporters framed Schiff's restraint as elite insulation, a luxury afforded only to those who never feel the consequences directly. They argued that decorum often protects abusers more than victims, that civility becomes a shield for those with power, and that sometimes the only way to redraw boundaries is to break the script. Schiff did not dismiss that frustration, but he warned that righteous anger has a short shelf life. Once it becomes habitual, it loses its moral clarity. It stops protecting and starts justifying. History offers countless examples of this transition. The tension between them was not moral versus immoral, it was immediate versus long-term thinking. Vance focused on stopping harm now. Schiff focused on preventing a worse pattern later. Both instincts are human, but only one can dominate without consequence. The conversation took a sharper turn when media amplification entered the frame. Vance's outburst spread faster than Schiff's warning ever could. Clips traveled without context, fueled by outrage algorithms. Supporters celebrated, finally telling the truth. Critics warned of erosion. This is not accidental. Modern politics rewards emotion over explanation. Anger compresses well into 30-second clips. Caution does not. Schiff understands this, which is precisely why he sounded measured. From my own perspective, this asymmetry matters more than either man's intent. A system that amplifies heat while burying restraint will inevitably drift toward escalation, not because people are worse, but because incentives are misaligned. Politics follows incentives, not virtues. Vance leaned into authenticity as his defense. He argued implicitly that voters are tired of curated responses. They want leaders who react the way normal people do. And in everyday life, anger at personal attacks is not only accepted, it is expected. That argument lands because it feels honest. But honesty without calibration becomes volatility. Schiff's counter was not about suppressing emotion. It was about absorbing it without letting it metastasize. A leader's job, in his view, is not to mirror the crowd. It is to slow it down when momentum turns dangerous. Here is a controversial question that neither side answered directly. When does authenticity become irresponsibility? Who decides when speaking plainly crosses into modeling harm? And why do audiences reward escalation while demanding stability at the same time? These contradictions sit at the heart of the outrage economy. The debate began revealing something uncomfortable about modern leadership. We now expect politicians to be both fighters and fixers. We cheer confrontation but demand calm outcomes. We want someone to burn the house down rhetorically, then rebuild it quietly. Those expectations are incompatible. Schiff's restraint risked appearing detached in this environment. Vance's anger risked appearing reckless. The media ecosystem amplified that contrast relentlessly. Outrage drove clicks. Nuance drove fatigue. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. Politicians escalate because escalation is rewarded. Audiences reward escalation because it feels validating. Restraint is mistaken for weakness, and weakness is punished at the ballot box. The generational divide only intensified the clash. Younger audiences, raised on unfiltered platforms, distrust polish. They read restraint as calculation, not maturity. Older audiences see escalation as instability. Both reactions are rational, but mutually exclusive. Vance's style speaks directly to voters who feel dismissed by institutions. Schiff's style reassures voters who fear chaos more than insult. Neither group is small, neither is going away, and neither feels fully represented by the other's priorities. The most biting humor surfaced when commentators joked that Washington wants leaders to be relatable until they actually relate. The laugh carried because it revealed a double standard. Emotion is celebrated when it aligns with expectation, condemned when it disrupts comfort. That hypocrisy fuels cynicism. As the exchange continued, the personal gave way to the systemic. This was no longer about one family or one outburst. It was about whether American politics still believes in restraint as strength, or whether escalation has become the new proof of sincerity. That shift has consequences far beyond this moment. Schiff warned that once leaders normalize emotional retaliation, rebuilding trust becomes harder, not because people are offended, but because boundaries dissolve. And without boundaries, every conflict feels existential. That is not sustainable. Vance warned, implicitly, that refusing to confront cruelty only emboldens it. That silence is often interpreted as permission, that lines left undefended cease to exist. There is truth in that warning, but truth can still be misapplied. The unresolved question lingered long after the clips stopped trending. What kind of leaders does this system reward? Those who absorb anger or those who project it? Those who calm the room or those who electrify it? And what does that say about the country's emotional state? If outrage continues to outperform restraint, more leaders will choose it, not because they are worse, but because survival demands adaptation. This is how systems change character without changing rules. Slowly, quietly, and with applause. The clash between Vance and Schiff was not a scandal. It was a signal. A glimpse into a political culture struggling to reconcile authenticity with responsibility, emotion with consequence, and power with restraint. By the time the argument reached its later phase, something unmistakable had changed. The noise around the moment had grown louder, but the substance beneath it had grown heavier. This was no longer about whether JD Vance had gone too far or Adam Schiff had been too cautious. It was about what kind of political behavior the system now rewards without hesitation. And if you think that question only matters to politicians, sit tight, because it defines the future of voters as much as leaders. JD Vance did not retreat after the backlash. That decision mattered. Retreat would have signaled regret, or at least recalibration. Instead, he doubled down on the underlying message, even as he softened the edges. The message was simple and dangerous in equal measure. There are lines that cannot be crossed, even in politics. Family is one of them, and anyone who pretends otherwise is lying to themselves or the public. That argument resonated because it feels intuitive. It appeals to something pre-political, something human. The problem is not that Vance was wrong to be angry. Anger in that context is understandable. The problem is what happens when understandable anger becomes a template. Templates are copied without context, and context is where responsibility lives. Adam Schiff understood this risk immediately. That is why his response never matched Vance's intensity. He was not trying to win the moment. He was trying to limit its blast radius. That is an unglamorous role in modern politics. Schiff's concern was not about one exchange. It was about precedent. When leaders respond emotionally from positions of immense power, the response becomes instructional. Others learn not just that anger is acceptable, but that it is effective. Effectiveness, in politics, quickly becomes obligation. This is where the outrage economy quietly enters the story. Media platforms do not reward restraint. They reward engagement. Engagement is driven by emotion, especially anger and indignation. The algorithm does not ask whether a response is responsible. It asks whether it spreads. Vance's moment spread. Schiff's caution did not. This imbalance is not ideological. It is mechanical. And mechanics shape outcomes regardless of intent. From my own perspective, this is the most dangerous element of the entire episode. Not Vance's anger, not Schiff's restraint, but the system that amplifies one and buries the other. A system like that does not need villains to drift toward chaos. As days passed, the public conversation hardened into camps. Some praised Vance for finally saying what others were afraid to say. Others accused him of lowering the bar for acceptable conduct. Few asked the harder question: what behavior does this moment incentivize next time? That question matters because politics is iterative. Each escalation becomes the baseline for the next. What shocks today becomes expected tomorrow, and what is expected eventually becomes demanded. This is how norms dissolve without formal repeal. Schiff's warnings began sounding almost anachronistic. Calls for restraint feel out of place in an environment addicted to spectacle. Caution is framed as weakness. Deliberation is framed as evasion. Leadership is increasingly confused with dominance. Vance's supporters rejected this framing outright. They argued that restraint had become a cover for abuse, that polite silence allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. That confrontation was not the problem, but the cure. This argument contains a painful truth. Institutions have failed to protect people from targeted harassment. Civility has often favored those already insulated from consequence. Calls for restraint have sometimes been weaponized to silence dissent. These realities cannot be dismissed, but they do not erase the risks of escalation. The tension between these truths is where modern American politics now lives, between the unresolved anger of those who feel ignored and the fear of those who believe chaos is only one step away. Vance speaks to the first group. Schiff speaks to the second. As the debate matured, it became clear that this clash was not about policy direction. It was about emotional governance, how leaders process and project feeling, how much volatility the system can absorb before it destabilizes, and whether voters actually want calm or just say they do. Polling data often shows Americans want less division. Behavior suggests otherwise. Outrage draws attention. Attention drives power. Power then feeds more outrage. This cycle does not require bad actors. It requires only misaligned incentives. Politicians respond to what works. Media amplifies what spreads. Audiences reward what validates them. The generational divide widened the gap further. Younger voters tend to distrust institutions instinctively. They see restraint as choreography. They value transparency, even when it is messy. Vance's approach feels authentic to them. Older voters, shaped by institutional breakdowns and historical crises, fear instability more than insult. They remember what happens when norms collapse. They value containment over catharsis. Schiff's approach feels responsible to them. Neither generation is wrong, but the system cannot satisfy both simultaneously. That is the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say aloud. A politics built on confrontation alienates those who crave stability. A politics built on restraint alienates those who feel unheard. This contradiction is tearing at the center of democratic life. The humor around the moment became darker as time went on. Jokes about Congress needing anger management sessions, remarks about politicians mistaking Twitter applause for moral authority. Laughter masked fatigue. Fatigue masked fear. Fear that politics is becoming performative rather than functional. Fear that emotional escalation is replacing institutional repair. Fear that leadership is being redefined by who can dominate the moment, rather than who can sustain the system. These fears are not partisan. They are symbols, not causes. The real issue is whether American politics can still distinguish between justification and permission, between understandable anger and sustainable leadership, between authenticity and accountability. If leaders are rewarded for escalation, escalation will multiply. If restraint is punished as weakness, fewer will practice it. If outrage becomes the default language of legitimacy, trust will erode faster than policy can compensate. These are not predictions. They are patterns already visible. The clash between JD Vance and Adam Schiff revealed something many suspected, but few wanted confirmed. American politics is no longer arguing about solutions. It is arguing about tone, posture, and emotional allegiance. Substance has become secondary to signal, and signal is governed by attention, not wisdom. The final controversial question lingers uncomfortably. Do Americans actually want leaders who calm the fire? Or do they want leaders who reflect it back at full volume? If the answer is the latter, Stability will always feel elusive, and if the answer is the former, incentives must change. In the end, this moment will not be remembered for its language. It will be remembered for what it normalized, whether it marked a line drawn or a line erased, whether anger became an exception or a standard, and whether restraint still has a constituency. Democracy does not collapse when people disagree. It collapses when disagreement becomes performance, when outrage replaces accountability, when attention replaces judgment, and when leaders follow the crowd instead of guiding it. JD Vance believes confrontation restores dignity. Adam Schiff believes restraint preserves stability. Both believe they are acting in defense of the country. Both may be right in part, but neither can succeed alone. The future of American politics will be shaped by which instinct voters reward more consistently: the instinct to fight, or the instinct to hold the line, the instinct to react, or the instinct to restrain. The cameras move on, the clips fade, but the incentives remain. And incentives, more than speeches, decide the direction of power. That is the quiet truth beneath all the noise.